If you were dropped into a plague year tonight, you would probably watch someone you love die within a week. Not because medicine failed you. Because everyone's medicine failed everyone. Your neighbors would seal their doors. Your city would burn its own homes to the ground. And somewhere, someone would decide that your life mattered less than the lives of everyone else on your street. For most of human history, disease was not an inconvenience. Disease was an extinction event with a heartbeat. It moved through villages faster than any army, and it did not care who you were. Not king. Not peasant. Not child. This is the terrifying truth about how ancient humans survived the plague. And by the end of this history documentary, you'll understand why scientists believe pandemics didn't just kill people, they rewired how humanity thinks, trusts, and fears forever. Because the people who survived history's worst plagues were not the healthiest. They were the ones willing to do things modern humans cannot even imagine. To understand how terrifying ancient plagues really were, you have to understand something modern humans take for granted. Nobody knew what disease actually was. There were no germs. No viruses. No bacteria under a microscope, because microscopes didn't exist yet. When entire families started coughing blood, or breaking out in black swollen lumps, or dying within 48 hours of the first fever, ancient humans didn't see a pathogen. They saw a curse. They saw punishment from the gods. They saw poison air rising from the earth itself. Physicians studying medieval medicine have found real medical texts blaming plague on bad air, on planetary alignments, on sin. Imagine watching your entire family die and having absolutely no framework to explain why. No enemy to fight. No shape to the thing that was killing you. That helplessness is the first thing you need to understand, because it explains everything that came next. When you cannot see your enemy, you start making terrifying decisions to survive it. Historians studying the Black Death in 14th century Europe discovered something disturbing hidden in old city records. When a household showed signs of plague, authorities in some towns didn't send help. They sent workers to seal the house shut, with the sick family still inside. Doors were boarded over, sometimes bricked. A red cross or a painted symbol marked the building as condemned, and guards were posted outside, not to protect the people inside, but to make sure no one left. Food was occasionally pushed through a gap. Sometimes not even that. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. City officials genuinely believed this was the only way to save everyone else. One infected household, left unchecked, could kill an entire street within days. So communities made a horrifying calculation: sacrifice the few, seal them away, and let the healthy survive. Some of the people bricked into their own homes were not even sick yet. They simply lived with someone who was. Anthropologists studying quarantine practices believe some of these sealed households held people who never caught the disease at all, and starved instead, walled inside their own front door, listening to their city continue living without them. This is the part of dark human history most documentaries avoid. Because it wasn't a mob. It wasn't chaos. It was official, organized, and calm. Ordinary people signing off on burying their neighbors alive, because the alternative felt worse. And then it got worse, because the bodies didn't stop coming. Archaeologists excavating medieval cemeteries have uncovered something researchers call plague pits, mass burial trenches containing dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies, stacked in careful, deliberate rows. Not thrown in randomly. Arranged. Layered. Which tells us something chilling: even in the middle of total catastrophe, someone was still organizing the dead like a terrible kind of inventory. During the worst weeks of the Black Death, historians estimate some European cities lost half their population in under a year. Gravediggers couldn't keep up. Church bells that once rang for every individual funeral stopped ringing altogether, because there simply wasn't time. In some towns, the job of collecting bodies fell to whoever was still standing. There's a detail that survives in old chronicles that's hard to shake. Cart drivers moved through the streets at night calling out for people to bring out their dead, and residents would leave bodies on their doorsteps like household waste, wrapped in whatever cloth they had left. children left beside parents. Entire families collected in a single mourning round. This wasn't disrespect. It was the only system exhausted survivors could maintain. Grief becomes a luxury when the death count outpaces the number of people left alive to mourn. Here's where the story turns from tragic to genuinely disturbing, because some people didn't respond to the plague with organization. They responded with their own bodies. Historians studying religious movements during the Black Death describe groups known as flagellants, processions of people who marched from town to town whipping themselves bloody in public squares. Not privately. Publicly, as performance, as prayer, as desperate bargaining with whatever force they believed controlled the disease. Some walked for weeks. Chronicles describe crowds gathering in town centers to watch, chanting, weeping, joining in. The theory was simple and horrifying. If the plague was divine punishment, then enough visible suffering might convince whatever was watching to stop. It didn't work, obviously. The disease had nothing to do with sin or salvation. But the flagellant movement spread almost as fast as the plague itself, sweeping through Germany, and eventually into France and beyond, until it became so large and uncontrollable that religious authorities eventually tried to ban it outright. Think about what that means. People in genuine, unbearable psychological agony, with no medical explanation for the horror around them, chose to inflict pain on their own bodies in public because it felt more bearable than helplessness. That's not fanaticism. That's what desperation looks like when there's nowhere else to put it. If you've ever seen the image of a figure in a long black coat and a beaked mask, that's not costume folklore. That was real medical equipment, worn by real physicians walking into homes filled with the dying. The beak wasn't decoration. It was stuffed with dried flowers, herbs, and spices, because doctors at the time believed disease spread through foul-smelling air, and the beak was meant to filter it. The long coat, the gloves, the wide-brimmed hat, all of it was armor against a threat nobody actually understood. Some plague doctors carried a wooden cane specifically so they never had to physically touch a patient. They would use it to check pulses, lift clothing, or point instead of making contact. Their treatments, by modern standards, were almost as dangerous as the disease. Bloodletting. Lancing swollen buboes with unsterilized blades. Rubbing mixtures of herbs, mercury, and sometimes crushed insects onto open wounds. And here's the detail that rarely makes it into the documentaries. Many plague doctors weren't even trained physicians. Actual doctors, understandably, refused the job. Cities were often forced to hire whoever would agree to walk into infected houses, sometimes offering enormous pay because the risk of death was so high. Some of these men had almost no formal medical training at all. They were essentially volunteers in a costume, walking directly into the deadliest buildings in Europe because someone had to, and nobody safer would do it. Here's the part of ancient plague history that's the hardest to sit with, because it isn't about strangers. It's about families. Chronicles from multiple plague outbreaks across history describe the same pattern repeating, generation after generation, culture after culture. When infection appeared inside a household, healthy family members sometimes left. Not out of coldness. Out of a brutal understanding that staying meant certain death for everyone. One famous account from 14th century Florence describes parents abandoning their own children once symptoms appeared, something the writer himself called almost impossible to comprehend, even as he witnessed it happening around him. Husbands left wives. Siblings left siblings. Not because they didn't love each other, but because love, in a plague year, sometimes meant walking away so that at least one of you survived to remember the other. This wasn't unique to Europe. Later outbreaks of plague and other epidemic diseases across Asia, Africa, and the Americas describe similar patterns. Isolated survivors. Empty villages. Family units that made silent, unbearable calculations about who could still be saved. Some researchers believe this pattern of abandonment, repeated across so many separate plague events throughout history, may be one of the oldest and most consistent human responses to mass disease. Not cruelty. A kind of triage, performed instinctively, by people with no doctors, no vaccines, and no other option. Some plague outbreaks didn't just kill people. They erased entire settlements from the map. Archaeologists studying deserted medieval villages have found what they call lost villages, sites where communities simply vanished during major plague years and were never rebuilt. Foundations still visible in aerial surveys. Streets that once held hundreds of people, now empty fields. During the 6th century, an outbreak now called the Plague of Justinian tore through the Byzantine Empire and the Mediterranean world with such force that some historians estimate it killed a significant percentage of the entire population of the region. Contemporary writers described bodies stacked in the streets faster than they could be buried, ships found drifting at sea with entire crews dead below deck, and cities so devastated that basic governance collapsed for years afterward. And centuries later, the Black Death would do it again, on an even larger scale, wiping out an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population within roughly 4 years. To put that in perspective, that's not a war. That's not a famine. That is nearly 1/3 of an entire continent's population disappearing in less time than it takes to finish high school. Entire trade routes went silent. Entire professions vanished because the people who practiced them were gone. Survivors inherited farmland, homes, and tools with no one left alive who remembered how to use them. Here's the part most people don't expect, because after the horror, something strange happened. The plague didn't just take from humanity. It restructured it. Historians studying the economic aftermath of the Black Death discovered something surprising. With so much of the population dead, labor suddenly became scarce and valuable. Surviving peasants, for the first time in centuries, had leverage. They could demand higher wages, better treatment, even mobility between towns that had been unthinkable before the plague. Some economists and historians argue this shift helped crack open the foundations of the feudal system itself, a system that had held much of Europe in rigid hierarchy for hundreds of years. The people who survived the darkest years of the plague ended up with more freedom and more power than their parents ever had, purely because so few of them were left to divide it among. It's a brutal kind of irony. Catastrophe, on a scale almost impossible to picture, ended up reshaping who held power in the world that came after it. Nothing about it was fair. But it happened again and again, across different plagues, in different centuries, in different parts of the world. But the strangest part of this story isn't something that happened centuries ago. It's something that might still be happening inside you right now. Researchers studying disgust and disease avoidance psychology have found that humans carry deeply wired instincts around illness that likely evolved directly from generations of plague survival. The reflexive step back when someone near you coughs. The discomfort around visible sores or wounds. The instinct to avoid crowded, enclosed spaces when sickness is going around. Scientists studying what's sometimes called the behavioral immune system believe these reactions aren't just modern hygiene habits. They may be ancient survival programming, inherited from ancestors who lived through outbreaks that killed 1/3 of everyone they knew. Think about how fast entire modern societies adopted isolation, distancing, and sealed off spaces during recent global health emergencies. Some researchers point out how eerily similar that instinct is to descriptions from plague chronicles written 700 years earlier. Boarding up homes. Avoiding neighbors. Watching the street from behind a closed door. Your body may still remember lessons your ancestors learned the hardest way possible. Not because you were taught them. Because the people who didn't feel that instinctive fear of contagion were far less likely to survive long enough to have descendants at all. And here's the detail almost no plague documentary mentions, because it isn't as visually dramatic as beaked masks or sealed doors. It's quieter than that, and somehow darker. Some of the deadliest plague years in history weren't stopped by medicine at all. They simply ran out of people close enough together to infect. Historians describe outbreaks slowing not because anyone found a cure, but because so many communities had already been devastated that there weren't enough densely packed, unexposed populations left for the disease to spread through efficiently. In other words, entire waves of history's worst pandemics ended the same brutal way they began. Through sheer, uncounted human loss. No hero. No breakthrough. No moment of triumph. Just exhaustion, on a scale large enough to finally starve the disease of new victims. That's not the ending anyone wants for a story like this. But it's the one history actually gives us, again and again, across plague after plague, century after century. So when you think about the darkest things ancient humans did to survive the plague, understand this. None of it came from cruelty. It came from a species with no doctors, no explanation, and no way to see the thing that was killing them, trying anything, absolutely anything, to keep even a fraction of their people alive until the next season. They sealed their neighbors inside burning homes. They whipped their own bodies bloody in public squares. They abandoned their own children. They buried the dead by the hundreds, in silence, because there was no time left for grief. And somehow, out of all of that horror, the survivors rebuilt entire civilizations from the wreckage. The terrifying truth is, if you had lived back then, with the same fear, the same helplessness, and the same impossible choices, you probably would have done the exact same things, too.